Mr. President, I want to speak in support of an amendment that was offered earlier today. Actually, it was filed. I don't think it was attempted to be called up by Senator Murkowski. The majority, Democrat majority, objected to getting a vote on that amendment, which I think suggests that they don't want to have a vote on that amendment. And frankly, I can see why. And from what I hear about the whole debate on climate change and cap-and-trade legislation that has passed in the House, it won't be voted on in the Senate this year. And the reason it won't be voted on is because there are a lot of people in this chamber, I think, who don't want to have that vote because they know it's a bad vote for them to make. Well, fear not, EPA has come to the rescue to people who want to see a lot of this stuff accomplished but don't want to have to make a tough political vote on it. And so what we're now faced with is the Environmental Protection Agency deciding that they're going to regulate carbon emissions under the Clean Air Act and moving forward with regulations to do just that. Now, what the Murkowski amendment did, Mr. President, was it would essentially prevent funds from being used to do that and weighs in favor of having Congress deal with this very complex, very weighty, very consequential, and very costly issue to the American people. This legislation, as we all know, would increase energy prices, cost us jobs, be unfair to entire regions of the country, mine included, enlarge an already bloated bureaucracy here in Washington, D.C., and put our nation at a certain economic disadvantage. And so I have been skeptical of that controversial legislation that has passed the House, the cap-and-trade bill over there, for some time for the reasons I just mentioned. And additionally, I think that it's fair to say that there would be very little environmental benefit derived from that legislation were it enacted without binding enforceable commitments by China, by India, and other developing countries that are now significant sources of carbon emissions. And so I find it disappointing that in the middle of that debate, this important debate, the administration has chosen to use the back door, which is issuing regulations to cap carbon dioxide under the Clean Air Act because they can't get the Waxman-Markey bill type climate bill through the front door. So instead, the relevant committees, in fact, instead of having it done that way through the EPA, the relevant committees here in the United States Senate ought to be, and the Senate as a whole ought to be considering whether now is the right time for a new massive energy tax disguised as an EPA regulation. During the previous administration, Mr. President, the EPA had published an advance notice of proposed rulemaking that showed just how impractical it would be to regulate carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. These onerous regulations, they covered homes, they covered schools, they covered churches, they covered hospitals, small businesses, and potentially even small farms with livestock. Under the Clean Air Act, the primary mechanism for regulating carbon emissions would be a fee placed on each ton of covered pollutant emitted above a certain threshold. This fee, if applied to carbon emissions, is nothing more than a tax. It's a tax on energy that would have severe consequences as our economy struggles to recover from a long recession. Now, while the previous administration's regulations never made it past an initial draft, the new administration in the EPA is moving quickly to finalize an endangerment finding and regulate carbon dioxide emissions. In April 2009, the EPA issued a draft endangerment finding that linked emissions from motor vehicles to an endangerment of human health. The comment period is closed on this draft endangerment finding, and when the EPA issues a final ruling, it will trigger an array of regulations under the Clean Air Act. These command and control regulations will have far-reaching consequences for our economy at a time when we can least afford it. According to media reports, EPA will eventually propose regulations for not just mobile sources, but stationary sources that emit over 25,000 tons of carbon dioxide. The first round of regulations on stationary sources would cover approximately 13,000 facilities here in the United States. These include power plants, large manufacturing facilities, refineries, fertilizer manufacturers, and a long list of other facilities that are critical to the health of our economy. In my state of South Dakota, these regulations would place a tax on power plants, ethanol refineries, and even our largest public university. And we need to remember that these companies will pass these new costs on to you and to me. Now is an especially bad time to saddle American people with what is in effect a gigantic new energy tax that would cause electricity, gasoline, and home heating costs to skyrocket. Additionally, pending the outcome of the final endangerment finding, the EPA might be legally bound to regulate all sources that emit over 250 tons of carbon dioxide. If this statutory threshold of the Clean Air Act is enforced, over 1 million carbon-emitting entities would be faced with the new tax, including commercial buildings, churches, homes, schools, restaurants, and manufacturing facilities, both large and small. Mr. President, regulation of carbon dioxide is far too important for EPA and the administration to craft expensive, cumbersome, top-down regulations under the Clean Air Act. Republicans in the Senate know this, Democrats in the Senate know this, the EPA knows this, and the White House knows this. Last year, Congressman John Dingell said that EPA greenhouse gas regulations would lead to a, quote, glorious mess, end quote. He continued to say, and I quote, as a matter of national policy, it seems insane that we would be talking about leaving this kind of judgment, which everybody tells us has to be addressed with great immediacy, to a long and complex process of regulatory action, end quote. Congressman Dingell said it best when he concluded that carbon regulation under EPA had, and again I quote, the potential for shutting down or slowing down virtually all industry and all economic activity and growth, end quote. According to the OMB memo associated with EPA's endangerment finding, making the decision to regulate CO2 under the Clean Air Act for the first time is likely to have serious economic consequences for regulated entities throughout the United States economy, including small businesses and small communities. Representative Colin Peterson, who is the chairman of the House Agriculture Committee, noted in a recent op-ed that EPA regulations of greenhouse gas emissions would result, and again I quote, Mr. President, in one of the largest and most bureaucratic nightmares that the U.S. economy and Americans have ever seen, end quote. Mr. President, Senator Murkowski and I have filed an amendment to the bill that's before us right now, the 2010 Interior and Environment Appropriations Bill, that would prohibit the EPA from moving forward with regulations on carbon dioxide emitted from stationary sources for 1 year. This amendment is not intended to impact the recent announcement from EPA and the Department of Transportation regarding new tailpipe emission requirements for new cars and light trucks. Additionally, this amendment is not intended to impact the regulation of other greenhouse gases, such as hydrofluorocarbons, which are also included in the proposed endangerment finding. This amendment would simply delay the expensive, top-down regulation of carbon emissions from thousands, if not a million, stationary sources in the United States. Mr. President, those senators who want to see cap-and-trade legislation moving up here in the Congress and having Congress address this issue should be voting for this amendment, should be supporting this amendment. This amendment isn't about whether carbon dioxide emissions should be regulated or where the federal government should take any action to reduce carbon emissions. Rather, this amendment is about the process of regulating carbon dioxide emissions. Should regulations as far-reaching and expensive as taxing carbon dioxide be determined by EPA bureaucrats behind closed doors? Or should carbon regulations, Mr. President, be openly debated on the floor of the United States Senate? The Murkowski Amendment gives the Senate a clear choice. Debating future climate change legislation, whether it's a cap-and-trade system or a carbon tax, should be debated openly on the floor of the United States Senate. Constituents, through their elected representatives, should have a voice in that debate. Carbon dioxide regulations move through the EPA unchecked. The American people will be deprived of their opportunity to be heard on this very important subject. Meanwhile, the cost of gasoline, electricity, food, and manufactured goods will skyrocket. Mr. President, I want to urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to acknowledge the extremely dangerous consequences of allowing the administration to unilaterally regulate carbon dioxide under the Clean Air Act. Now, I understand that the Murkowski Amendment is not going to be allowed to be voted on. I believe that the regulations that amendment addresses being proposed by the EPA should be delayed until Congress has the opportunity to fully debate the consequences of these regulations. And I'm going to continue to work with Senator Murkowski and other colleagues and those families and those small businesses across this country to make them aware of what the EPA intends to do by regulation. And, Mr. President, what I would like to do, in addition to speaking to the Murkowski amendment, is I have filed an amendment which is similar. And I want to call that amendment up, Mr. President, and ask that it be made pending.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President, let me just very briefly speak to this amendment because it simply addresses this subject in a slightly different way. And it's very clear that the majority does not want to have a vote on either the Murkowski amendment or my amendment because they get at the heart and the fundamental issue here, which is whether or not we're going to have a debate here in Congress about regulating CO2 emissions or whether we're going to allow an administrative agency, a bureaucracy down at the EPA to do that for us. Now, I understand my amendment, which has now been objected to, is not going to have a vote. We know that where the votes are on this right now. But like the Murkowski amendment, what my amendment is designed to do is to shed daylight on harmful regulations that are taking shape behind the closed doors at EPA. This amendment, my amendment, is designed to give our constituents a greater say in climate change regulations. The amendment is also designed to force the EPA to consider the dramatic impact that these new Clean Air Act regulations on carbon dioxide will have on electricity and gasoline prices. If these regulations move forward, I'm concerned that many families, especially those who rely on coal-generated electricity, will see skyrocketing electricity bills. I'm also concerned for families and truck drivers who could see gasoline and diesel prices go up dramatically. EPA regulation of carbon dioxide would amount to a tax on millions of working-class families. During debate of the climate change bill, proponents of a cap-and-trade system claim that lower-income families will be made whole by giving local distribution companies free allowances to meet the new carbon regulations. Aside from whether this mechanism would actually limit the impact on working families, it is clear that such a safeguard is simply not possible under the Clean Air Act. Carbon regulations under the Clean Air Act would effectively be a huge new tax on electricity and gasoline prices that will be paid by families and small businesses. Additionally, new taxes under the Clean Air Act would also apply to oil and ethanol refineries. Now, in my home state of South Dakota, we produce approximately 1 billion gallons annually of ethanol. If the EPA moves forward with carbon caps under the Clean Air Act, 12 ethanol plants in South Dakota will be subject to this new tax. Additionally, we'll have a large soybean processing facility that hopes to soon produce biodiesel that would also be covered by this new tax. Not only will these costs be passed on to consumers, Mr. President, in the form of higher prices at the pump, but the new regulations will be a major setback to renewable fuel production in the United States. And in the end, the energy security benefits of domestic renewable fuel production will be greatly impacted, negatively impacted, by these new regulations. My amendment, number 2540, simply asks EPA to consider these costs and the adverse impacts these regulations will have on our economy before moving forward with an endangerment finding. Mr. President, it's clear that neither the Murkowski amendment nor my amendment will be voted on, but I will tell you this issue is not going away. The EPA is moving forward. The House has acted on this issue. The Senate doesn't want to take the hard votes on this issue, the tough political votes, and so they've sort of punted it to the EPA. And so the EPA is now moving forward by regulation to do what Congress doesn't have the courage or the will to do, and that's to have a debate about the relative costs and perhaps benefits of climate change legislation. And it is wrong to for us to allow the bureaucracy at the EPA to move forward with these regulations that could be so harmful to our economy, so harmful to jobs, so disastrous when it comes to the energy prices that are paid by families and small businesses across this country. And so this issue will be back. Senator Murkowski will bring it back. I will bring it back. Others of my colleagues who care about the impacts of this particular regulation on small businesses and families in our states will be back to debate this issue, even though the Democrat majority will not allow us to get a vote on it today. Mr. President, I yield back the balance of my time.